Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we welcome you once again to the airwaves of Salam Media. We've just heard the completion of the Taraweeh Salah, and tonight being the 11th of Ramadan, Alhamdulillah, we trust and hope that you are enjoying the beauty and the blessings of this beautiful month of Ramadan. This is a special broadcast, and it is going to be a special broadcast on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays because a lot is happening right across the entire world, even though it is the month of Ramadan. And the biggest talking point in the last few days has been the political crisis that has been unfolding in Pakistan. And many questions have been raised. And one of the questions that has been raised is, why do Imran Khan's enemies want him out? We know for the fact that the Prime Minister Imran Khan has been vulnerable to attack both domestically and externally since coming into power in 2018. And the mere fact that few democratically elected leaders of Pakistan have lasted long, in fact, not a single one of Imran Khan's predecessors has survived a full term since the country's founding 75 years ago. And tonight we are going to be unpacking some of the issues with regard to Imran Khan and the political crisis that has been unfolding in Pakistan. And we know it's very, very late out in Pakistan, almost 1 a.m. And we are going to be joined now by journalist Ahmed Quraishi out of Pakistan. Brother Ahmed, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ramadan Kareem to you. We trust and hope that you are having a wonderful Ramadan. Inshallah.
Ramadan Kareem to you too, brother Inayet. Good to see you always. Hope it's a great month for all of us.
I know it's very late, and I know the last few days have been extremely busy for you, for journalists like yourself, covering the developments in Pakistan. Now, the mere fact that the Prime Minister Imran Khan is out at this point in time, and we know, and the point I had made in my introduction is he has been vulnerable to attack for a long time. In fact, since coming into power in 2018. So this has come as no surprise that he has not served his full term of office, Brother Ahmed.
Actually, Brother Inayet, I met the Prime Minister at his residence along with a group of journalists just 2 months after he took power. And it was a weekend, and he was meeting with a group of journalists. And I happened to be added to the group at the very last minute. To cut a long story short, just 2 months into his government, I actually sat and I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I think it will be very difficult for you, really, to continue and reach the end of your term, considering, and we could see as journalists, even so early in his tenure, that things are stacking up against him. It was so very obvious. And I would say most of it really has to do with his style of politics. You have to understand also, Brother Inayet, that Prime Minister Imran Khan never practiced politics in a sense that he never actually ran huge election campaigns except for 2 in his entire political career. And he never actually ran or was in public office at any time. So it was, and he admitted that. I mean, I give him credit for the fact that just a year or so ago, he came out, in a couple of interviews, and he said, I admit I was a little not prepared. I should have been better prepared. I should have had a better team. So the point is, what I'm trying to convey here is that some of his political inexperience actually added to his troubles and problems. Probably a politician with a little bit of better experience and better advisors, and with the kind of celebrity status that he has, he would have lasted, I would say, at least for 2 terms, very easily. But it's a huge surprise for many that he didn't. But for journalists like me, and there are many journalists like me who actually believe that it was quite obvious for us early in his term that he might find it difficult to really complete his term. And I must say this, he's one of the strongest, when I say this, I realize that he's one of the strongest prime ministers that Pakistan ever had in 75 years. This is very important to understand. One of the strongest. Why? Because no prime minister in Pakistan received the kind of support from the military establishment in Pakistan the way he did. And he was so strong that honestly, for the first 2.5 years of his government, I think every political party in the country, every politician, every journalist probably was convinced Khan is facing troubles, but he has the support of the military, so he'll pull through. So he was one of the strongest prime ministers and definitely a celebrity. So he's really very famous. He has a vote base, and you have to distinguish between the people who are his fans because he's a celebrity cricket player and the people who became his fans later because he's a politician. Even his worst enemies in Pakistan concede that he's a hero for Pakistan as a sportsman, as a cricket player. But of course, the situation is different when you talk about his politics.
Well, certainly, Brother Ahmed, and also the mere fact that, you mentioned a bit of political immaturity on his part and the lack of inexperience. But Imran Khan is no ordinary, in fact, he was no ordinary prime minister. As you mentioned, he was brave. He showed exceptional courage because what we've seen in the last 3 years or so, where he challenged a vested interest, he tried to root out corruption, but also at the same time, when one looks at Pakistan, its independent foreign policy, he tried to forge a new policy. And at the same time, he also jeopardized his own position by refusing point blank to be the pawn of the United States of America, and especially those who have done Pakistan a lot of harm over the years.
Right. This is a very contentious point, mainly because there's no question that Prime Minister Imran Khan was very sincere to his ideas about foreign policy, and he felt very, very passionately about them. And it was obvious not just when he seized power, when he came to power, but actually several years before that, as early as 2010 and 2011 and 2012. Way before he came to power in 2018, we saw his ideas on foreign policy, specifically with regards to critiquing U.S. foreign policy and so forth. So that's very obvious. On the other hand, some of us now, with the benefit of hindsight, feel that probably Prime Minister Imran Khan was full of rage that he wanted to bring out now that he has the opportunity being the prime minister. But I think the timing was not right. See, the Americans were very, very engaged inside Pakistan about 8 or 10 years earlier. I'm talking about 2010, 27, up until the operation of Abbottabad, the Osama bin Laden in 2011. And after that, the Americans actually disengaged and distanced themselves from Pakistan and pulled out lots of their presence inside Pakistan and kept it very, very limited to the US Embassy and the diplomatic channels and the military to military cooperation, occasionally working together with Pakistan on Afghanistan, but mostly staying away. So after 2011 and 12, the US became disengaged with Pakistan. When Prime Minister Imran Khan came to power in 2018, he was filled with rage that I think he kept inside him from 8 years earlier. And by the time he came to speak and talk about the US and its influence and so forth in 2018, that was a time when a lot of us, for example, I'm one of the journalists who I basically, my beat is national security. So I cover national security and Pakistan's military relations with its key partners, mainly, of course, the US. And it is my understanding that the US actually disengaged. It was not involved. So to cut a long story short, Prime Minister Imran Khan had a lot of rage. He had a lot of criticism dating back to maybe a decade earlier. But by the time he came to power and he started talking about it, that timing actually was a timing of already distanced relationship between Pakistan and the US. So a lot of people actually asked a question, why is Prime Minister Imran Khan talking about the Americans now when actually we have a bad relationship with them. We are far away, and we are not interfering in each other's affairs. So that was a key point that a lot of people raised. But you have to keep one more thing in mind, brother Inayet. Prime Minister Khan took issue with the U.S. toward the end of his term. So it really happened just 6 months ago? I think 4 months ago. 4 months ago. But for most of the 4 years that he's been in government, he was really not locked in conflict with the U.S. In fact, he developed a very, very good relationship with President Trump in 2019. He went to the White House. He was received very, very well by President Trump. He was so excited, and he addressed one of the largest gatherings by a foreign leader in Washington, D.C. at that time, in one of the stadiums or arenas in Washington, D.C., one of the largest, and lots of Pakistani Americans obviously attending. So he was so happy that when he returned to Islamabad, he said this at the airport. He said, I'm so full of joy that I feel like once again I brought to Pakistan the World Cup in cricket, like he did in 1992, 30 years ago. So actually his relationship with the US was really very good. It worsened only now just 2 or 3 months ago. But what happened early in his term is that he went head on in conflict with other partners, key partners of Pakistan. He went head on with Saudi Arabia, with the United Arab Emirates. His relationship with China was not good. A lot of the people don't know this. Before the US and before Russia and before all these other foreign policy issues, actually Prime Minister Imran Khan's relationship soured with China. But the only difference is that China, as you very well know, is always very discreet in its foreign policy. So the Chinese really never talk openly and don't publish articles. But they were very, very upset with the government of Prime Minister Khan. Why? Because they felt and they suspected that Prime Minister Khan actually slowed down Chinese investments and the Belt and Road Initiative projects, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the so-called CPEC. Prime Minister Khan slowed down. And it is true that a lot of these projects really slowed down, and Prime Minister Khan was actually critical of this project before he came to power because he suspected the Chinese were involved in corruption and corrupt practices with Khan's predecessor, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's government. So to cut a long story short, Prime Minister Khan, when he came to power, he actually didn't go head on against the West or the US. He actually he developed troubles with China, with Saudi Arabia, and with the United Arab Emirates. And with the OIC. Then somewhere in the middle, he developed a problem with the OIC. And there was a huge problem, which also involved Turkey and Malaysia. And all of these countries now have excellent relationship. Turkey, Malaysia, the Saudis, the other countries, the OIC members, all of them are now have patched up. But Pakistan, and specifically Prime Minister Khan's government, suffered a lot on the diplomatic front. The Americans came toward the end, just 2 or 3 months ago, when Prime Minister Khan first revealed that he received a direct communication from a foreign government threatening him and his government directly. And when it raised a lot of hue and cry, this claim, he said, well, it's not a direct letter from a foreign government. It's actually a diplomatic cable from a Pakistani ambassador. It turned out to be the Pakistani ambassador in the US, in DC, in Washington, that he wrote a letter about his meeting with a US official who, according to the Prime Minister, threatened him. Now, this is a huge controversy, and yesterday, when the new Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, took power, he actually addressed this particular point in his opening statement in the Pakistani parliament when he said, you know what, I would like to put this whole story to rest. He said very clearly he does not believe that there is a threat, but he said in order to deal with it in a mature way, because a former prime minister raised this issue, and you cannot underestimate it. After all, he's the prime minister, the former prime minister, Prime Minister Khan. So the new prime minister said, well, what I'm going to do is sometime next week, I will call the National Security Committee of the Parliament, and I will bring the heads of the Pakistan Armed Forces, and I will bring the head of the intelligence. And I will also bring the Pakistani ambassador in Washington, D.C., who's now moved to Brussels. I'll bring him, And since he wrote the diplomatic cable, let's sit and let's ask the people, is there really a threat? His answer, he answered his own question. He said, I don't think there's a conspiracy, but since a former prime minister raised it and it's an issue, let's deal with it. Let's put it to rest. So it's very important to put in context the fact that the Prime Minister Khan did not begin his government fighting with the US or with the West. It came really toward the end, and mainly because of Ukraine. Most of his tenure really was spent in diplomatic tussles with China, with OIC, with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, Turkey, Malaysia, all of that stuff. So, I mean, that's just to sum it up. If you have a question, it's a very long story, obviously.
Yes, I know. Look, we're not going to be doing justice to this discussion in a few minutes because there is just so much that one can actually unpack. And I just want to look at some of the internal dynamics that have been playing out and looking at the opposition, looking at the likes of the PPP and the PML. And obviously, some are of the opinion that in the garb of democracy, this was actually a coup. By taking Prime Minister Imran Khan out. And also at the same time, looking at internally some of the arguments that have been placed in terms of the country, in terms of the economic mess that the country is in at this point in time. But the mere fact, Brother Ahmed, is Imran Khan inherited an economic mess when he took office 4 years ago. We've seen the legacy of mismanagement by I think it was the Pakistan Muslim League. At that point in time, he inherited an empty treasury, a broken tax system, and he had a massive task on his hand to try and obviously bring some sanity to the economy in more ways than one.
Yes, and a lot of people say he worsened it instead of improving it. Of course, I'm not going to defend Prime Minister Khan's opponents. And I will also not take his side. But as a neutral observer, what I'm just going to say is this. Prime Minister Khan actually he obviously, and you're so right, he inherited a mess. There's no question about this. But also there's another truth. He had the best opportunity of all of these previous governments to get Pakistan out of it. Why? Because he is an international face. He still is, obviously, a celebrity. He had great ingress in important countries in the world. People knew him in London, in the British royal family, in Europe. He has, for most of his life, has been socializing with the elite in Europe, with the royals in royal families in Europe. He's known in the US, obviously not as a sportsman celebrity. Nobody plays cricket in the U.S., but he was known, and he used to socialize in the elite upper echelons of New York City, for example. And so he had the ability, and when he came to power, I noticed much of the media coverage in the Middle East, in South Asia, in India, in China, in Russia, worldwide was really very positive because, after all, he was a colorful personality. Celebrity. For some time, he was known to be a playboy. Of course, he changed. So he was a really very colorful personality. Because of all of this, he had the best chance compared to any other Pakistani politician to really make deals for Pakistan, maybe write off some loans for Pakistan with some of our key partners and lenders. He had so many things that he could have done. Unfortunately, for many, many reasons, he didn't. He also got a little distracted. For example, let me give you one example, one very, very interesting example. Prime Minister Khan is very passionate about Islamophobia, and he worked very hard on it. He deserves credit for it, obviously. He did very, very well. He was passionate. He worked with the OIC at a later point and other Muslim countries, and everybody managed to get this very, very important Islamophobia resolution at the UN General Assembly. A very important achievement for him and for OIC and for all Muslims, definitely. At the same time, because of his passion, he had a very interesting meeting with President Erdogan in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, and with then President, or I think he was Prime Minister at that time, Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia. I think this was in 2019, September. And he met with them separately in New York. And when the three of them sat together, they discussed many things and agreed on a lot of things. But one of the key ideas that Prime Minister Khan came up with was to establish an Islamophobia TV channel in order to talk about Islamophobia and spread awareness. A noble idea, no doubt about this. That was 2019. This is 2022. Prime Minister Khan is not in government. The idea never took off. Many of the critics of Prime Minister Khan say that Prime Minister Khan actually was very, very idealistic, because his two other partners in this project, Prime Minister Mahathir and President Erdogan, returned to their countries and focused on the economies of their countries. Malaysia and Turkey both specifically worked very, very hard on their tourism and other sectors of the economy. Prime Minister Khan was more focused on these idealistic projects. Noble, no question about it. You cannot blame Prime Minister Khan for being noble, for being idealistic. That's a good thing. But his critics say, well, you're not just a philosopher, you're also a prime minister. You have a country to run, you have people, and they have requirements and needs, and you need to work on the economy. So some of his critics said, well, Prime Minister Khan, instead of focusing on idealistic long-term projects that anyone else could have done instead of the prime minister in your position, you should have focused really on the Pakistan's economy, make it strong. Once Pakistan's economy is strong, you can establish 5 Islamophobia TV channels and work on them. But if you're not strong, you can't even establish one. And he didn't, unfortunately. So I'm giving you this example, brother Inayet, just to give you an idea about how idealistic some of the policy goals of Prime Minister Khan were. And those idealistic policy goals, definitely, idealism is never achieved in 3 or 4 years. You need to work on a generation of people, 10 years, 15 years. But there were other urgent things that Prime Minister Khan should have worked on that would have been his achievement, which is to improve the economy of Pakistan. That's what President Erdogan did. When he came to power 15 or 17 or 18 years ago, he did not go pursuing his idealistic goals. He went on to improve Turkey's economy. And that's exactly what Prime Minister Mahathir did as well. He worked on Malaysia's economy. And once these two countries were strong, that's when we saw President Erdogan move on to his other passions. And he had so many of them, to revive the memory of the Ottoman Empire and so many other things that he worked on. The Hagia Sophia Mosque, for example. He did not take up these projects, President Erdogan, early in his term. He kept it for when he's strong. Prime Minister Khan probably made the mistake of taking up this gigantic, huge projects very early on when he's weak. He has a weak economy. His people are expecting him to improve things, not worsen them. Now, just to conclude, Brother Inayet, this whole argument that I gave you, just to conclude, when he left now, Prime Minister Khan, imagine, I feel sorry when I say this, because this is a man, Prime Minister Khan, who really had passion. I'm sure that he was sincere with his objectives. But when he left Pakistan with $53 billion debt that he borrowed in 4 years. To $53 billion. In 4 years, this amount is more than what Pakistan accrued in terms of debt in 72 years, from 1947 till when Prime Minister Khan took office in 2018. These are certified and verified figures. I mean, these are the figures of the government of Pakistan itself. This is not an analytical figure. It's taken from the government of Pakistan's website. So the point is, Prime Minister Khan, while pursuing his idealistic goals, very noble goals, I think he was distracted from the task at hand, which is to look after the Pakistani people and strengthen his country, his people, and move forward. And unfortunately, that's one example, the huge debt that is now left. He was criticizing the predecessors, and he was criticizing them rightly on many, many things, maybe wrongly on some things, because, you know, there's always a political vendetta and political opportunism, obviously. But on many of the things, he was criticizing them on the right things, on many things, on economic management and so forth. But instead of leaving the country better, then they left the country. He left the country actually worse. And right now, one more thing before I go, one of the things that people criticize Prime Minister Khan also on is that he leaves the country more divided. Pakistanis are really very divided. Now, brother, and I just right now, just before you and I come together, I was just looking at my WhatsApp groups. You know what's the hottest video right now tonight in all of the WhatsApp groups in Pakistan right now on the cell phone? It's a video of an iftar dinner party which happened in one of the five-star hotels in Islamabad just 5 hours ago, and it's a fist fight. There were two lawmakers sitting having their iftar in the hotel, and lots of families were sitting and having their iftar, and one gentleman, apparently looking very graceful with a nice white beard, just like yours, Brother Inayet, very graceful, very nice, very well dressed, looked like a very decent, graceful person. And he came and he stood up and he went to the table of these two lawmakers. One was from the opposition and one was from Prime Minister Khan's party. He was a member of the National Assembly, a parliamentarian. But he ditched Prime Minister Khan and voted against him in the vote of no confidence. So this gentleman, who's a supporter of Prime Minister Khan, stood up. He was sitting with his family. He stood up from his table. He walks up to the other table and he says bad things about these two lawmakers. And specifically to the guy who was from Mr. Khan's table, he said, "You're a turncoat. You're a turncoat. You're a deceiver." And a long list of expletives. And there was a huge fist fight. This is just the tip of the iceberg. The country right now, Pakistan, the society, politically, we might have calmed down a little now after the new prime minister took over. But socially, there's a huge, huge tension in the country. Last week, we in Pakistan were on the verge, probably, God forbid, civil war. Had the Supreme Court not intervened, it was terrible on the night of 9 April over the weekend on Saturday. We were this close to people coming out on the streets and just hell breaking loose. It didn't happen. Thank Allah, it didn't happen. But the point is that the country is left now very, very weak. I see that you're showing a very interesting tweet by the Prime Minister, and I saw this video that he released to his followers on Twitter today evening, and I think will be holding his first political rally after leaving office tomorrow in Peshawar. And I'm sure it's going to be a jam-packed event because he has a huge, huge following. There's no question about it.
Yes, and just before we take leave of you, I know it's quite late. Just very quickly, as you mentioned, that Imran Khan had idealistic goals, and one of his goals was to shape Pakistan into an independent nation and make Pakistan not dependent on the likes of the US and other external forces. Just like Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, he was idealistic as well. So one can see similar traits between the two of them. But just coming to the opposition, they say the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And we've got the likes of the PML and the PPP, and we know we've got the MQM. Now they basically all come together. And it's going to be quite interesting to see how all these parties work together now that they've come together with regard to this vote of no confidence in removing Imran Khan. So it's going to be very interesting to see how Pakistan is going to be governed by these various parties.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very fascinating. But you mentioned, Brother Inayet, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And Prime Minister Khan obviously was very, very fascinated with him. It really amused his opposition because the Bhutto's party is leading the opposition against Prime Minister Khan. So imagine the irony where Prime Minister Khan in several of his rallies praises Bhutto. And Bhutto's party actually is leading the opposition, and in fact, it led the drive to get Prime Minister Khan out of government and end his government. So it was actually Bhutto's party whom he admired so much. But just to move on to the political parties things that you asked, let me just tell you one very interesting thing. Prime Minister Bhutto stood up to Western influence, there's no question about it. But he's also credited with, in doing so, destroying Pakistan's economy. Up until early 1970s, Pakistan was one of the rising economies of Asia, and in fact, with fondly, people recall that Pakistan used to receive delegations from South Korea and Singapore and Dubai and China to learn from Pakistan's early industrialization experience and so forth. And this country actually went down because of nationalization and some of these socialist policies that Prime Minister Bhutto brought. But obviously, his intention was good. He wanted to sort of seek independence, and maybe he was willing to pay a price initially. It might have worked. Who knows? Had he lived. But it didn't, and Pakistan really went down the economy, and we never recovered from those years. It's almost the same with Prime Minister Khan. Lofty ideals, independence, and so forth, but actually he leaves a very bad economy. I will stop here because that's a long discussion. But just to come to your point about how the political parties will be working, it's going to be very, very difficult. Let's see how it happens. But there's a silver lining, Brother Inayet. After a long, long time, we see Pakistan's major political parties acting very, very responsibly, very responsibly. So, and the credit really goes, ironically, to Prime Minister Khan for that. He united them. He pushed all of them to unite against him. So, in leaving, in his defeat, Prime Minister Khan did something good, actually. He did actually two good things. He united, I won't say united, but he actually brought all of these political parties on a single platform. They are talking to each other in a civilized way. They're cooperating. They're giving and taking. They are adjusting each other. The new government that is taking over Pakistan right now will be a coalition government of all the parties that used to be the opposition parties. Right now in Pakistan, we have only one opposition party, and that is Prime Minister Khan's party. But it resigned from the parliament. It's not yet clear how many of Prime Minister Khan's people will actually resign and how many will stay back. So we have to see in the next couple of days. But the point is that we see a moment of civility in Pakistani politics. So that's one good thing. The other good thing is, after a long, long time, we see Pakistan's institutions working in a very responsible way. We see the Supreme Court of Pakistan, we see the parliament, we see the military, all of them emphasize the supremacy of the constitution. Amazing. For the first time, we see the military actually not taking the lead. We see the military saying, you know what? We will support the Supreme Court, we will support the parliament, we will support the political parties in what they want to do with the country's future. So it's a rare moment of civility in Pakistani politics. Amazing. I hope it continues. And I hope that Prime Minister Khan's party plays the role of positive opposition that keeps a check on the government. So far, he's not doing that, unfortunately. I'm sure you know, he's very, when he has an idea, he just pursues that idea. And his idea right now is to boycott the parliament and the government and just go to the streets. But going to the streets will not be good for him, will not be good for the society, for the country. We need to move on. And, you know, it's politics. He can come back to power if he wants in the next election, and which I think is going to be in a year or year and a half from now. So he still has an opportunity. But let's hope that he plays positively and does not get bitter, because he's very, very bitter. An ideological person who's idealistic, very easy to get bitter. But I think he needs to learn from the examples of the people he admired, like Bhutto, like President Erdogan, like Prime Minister Mahathir, and others. He needs to learn to be a good politician and not just an idealistic person.
Well, Ahmed, I must say it's been a fascinating discussion, and we basically scratched the surface, but I'm sure there's going to be very, very interesting developments over the next few days and months as well. And I'm sure you and I will be touching base at some point in time. And I know it's been quite late. We must apologize for keeping you up so late in Pakistan.
I'm very happy to be with you. Very happy to be with you.
I wish you all the best, inshallah, and have yourself a wonderful Ramadan. Once again, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Ahmed Quraishi, unpacking the fall of the Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan. Ahmed Quraishi is with PVT News. He is a journalist, and some very, very interesting observations that have been made in unpacking what has been taking place in Pakistan. And I'm sure there is a lot more. And this is what we are planning to do, inshallah, during the month of Ramadan. After the Taraweeh at around 9:15, inshallah, Mondays to Wednesdays, we will be touching on a number of issues, and particularly issues that are impacting. We know that a lot is happening in Palestine at this point in time, also Afghanistan. We know with regard to the French elections again, once again, Islamophobia featuring very, very prominently, and hopefully tomorrow we will be able to touch on the French elections and to see how Muslims will be affected with the outcome as far as the ultra-right candidate who has basically come into power. So with that, I'm going to be signing off. It's been wonderful being in your company. Continue enjoying the blessings of this month of Ramadan. And until we meet tomorrow at around 9:15, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.